Hello everyone, this is Scott Ferguson, Principal Architect with ServiceNow. Today we're going to go through the risk management demo. As we talk about risk management today, the first thing that we do is we start with the risk overview dashboard. And in this dashboard, the thing that we'll point out is across the top of the dashboard is quick, easy access to the current state of the risks within an organization. But the inherent risk is, as risks are identified, as risks are assigned to their various risk owners, they have an inherent risk score, which is prior to any kind of response, prior to any kind of mitigation, prior to any kind of activity around reducing that risk to the organization, is what inherent is. And the other thing that we'll point out here on the dashboard is for customers that adhere to a qualitative approach to risk scoring versus quantitative, we have this inherent risk heat map. And this heat map is going to be configurable with the red, yellow, green. But it's not just a qualitative approach for those organizations that are quantitative in nature. As we scroll down, you'll see this bubble chart here at the bottom, and it's the reason we use this bubble chart is it's really multifaceted. It's not a two-dimensional qualitative one is. The quantitative uses various aspects. So we start off with some things like our annual rate of occurrence, right? How often, how many times a year would that risk potentially be exploited? What's the single loss expectancy, or the SLE, which is, if this risk was to be exploited, what's the cost to an organization? And you bring those together from an ARO and SLE to give you your annualized loss expectancy. So depending upon how you approach risk scoring, there's a couple of different ways that may manifest itself in the reporting, and both of them are available on the dashboard. As I scroll back up here to the top, you'll notice, right, and if we have that kind of tracker across the top, the residual risk reports on the next tab over is going to show us what happens after action is taken, right? And we see that number was greatly reduced. We went from over 400 high inherent risk to just 26 from a residual risk. And what that means is the organization, has put some controls in place. They've greatly reduced the risk exposure to the organization through the process within the ServiceNow platform. And the first thing that I want to do here, and I'm going to switch back to our inherent risk report, is maybe I want to take a look at like just a financial application. So I can filter, because this is a premium PA dashboard, I have the ability to use these interactive filters. And when I do something like select financial accounting, I'm able to really hone in on just the risk. I'm going to drill into this very high risk inherent risk score at the top of the dashboard. And what that's going to do is take us into, in this case, the risk register, so to speak, of ServiceNow. I'm going to look at, in this case, that loss of availability risk, right? That one that's assigned to James. It was, red on the dashboard. And the first thing that I want to point out here is that there's a life cycle to a risk, right? We've got those good practice life cycles baked into the platform with the various applications. So in risk management, what we see is, from a draft perspective, a risk is first identified, whether it's coming to us through the system systematically from a risk framework and risk statements, which we won't get into during this demo, but that's part of the risk application. So these risks through the entities and the entity types can be dynamically assigned to people within the organization, or it could be a risk that's identified through a service portal where someone's identifying something and they want to get that logged, that tracked, so that the organization can respond to that. So regardless of where it comes from, it's going to come in this draft state, and then we're going to move to assess. So it's been identified, it's been assigned. How bad is it? This is where that assess phase is going to come in, and we're going to do that through some assessment that's assigned to someone that they can respond to within the service portal. And then you go through, responding. How are we going to address this risk? Someone's going to review it, and then we're going to move into a monitor state where we continue to monitor that risk and our exposure and then respond as necessary. So this is all part of that life cycle of the risk. But one of the things here that we also want to take a look at is maybe someone wants to look at the way this was responded to. We can see down here on the related list at the bottom of assessments all of the questions that were asked. The category, there was an inherent risk question around what's the potential financial impact, and James responded with a particular value. In this case, he said, it's highly likely. So we see all of those responses, and the history of those responses are available for a risk manager down here at the bottom. Now that it's been assessed and we've moved from this assessment phase into respond, we need to understand what is our response to this risk going to be. And typically we see this, and I'll click on the response section here in the middle of the form. And essentially within this section, we have an opportunity to choose really 4 different ways to respond to this risk. We can accept it, and if we accept it, it's going to go down this approval process, and an accept is going to be one of those things where, yes, we know that the cost of fixing or mitigating a risk, or the cost of it being exploited, would be far greater than us actually putting the mitigating controls in place. So they're saying, well, you know what, we're going to accept this, because if it gets exploited, it's less to us than actually trying to fix it. And in that case, though, there has to be some approvals, and that's built in here to the platform, right? Avoid, maybe there's a risk of something exploiting systems that are web-based. Well, maybe we just don't do web-based, right? We're going to avoid that. Or transfer to buy an insurance policy. In this case, though, we want to mitigate it. So we need to respond to this and put controls in place that are going to mitigate this risk and drive that risk exposure down to a lower residual risk score. So when we select this mitigate, what we're going to do is, within the system, is it's going to generate a risk response task. And this risk response task is going to be assigned to an individual. And I'm going to select this mitigation task record that is a part of this, and because this may be assigned to someone different. Right? So James is the owner of SAP, but the person that's going to manage the mitigating controls that are related to this, maybe someone else on the team. In this case, it's assigned to Grace. She needs to put together this mitigation plan. And here we can document what that plan is. In this, though, you have the ability to associate controls that maybe were related to authoritative documents as mitigating controls that will reduce the risk of loss of availability, which is that risk that we're looking at. So as all part of building out this plan, Grace can say, these are the controls that are going to be tied to this. Here's our plan to respond, and they can take this through the rest of the life cycle. And that information then becomes part of the mitigation, and then we would move forward in the process, and someone would need to review this. Now that we kind of move back, right, and we're looking at that loss of availability risk again, the next thing that I want to point out is down here, there may be those 4 controls that Grace is associated to this risk as mitigating controls, but we can see that, in our environment, we've actually associated some other controls to this risk as well. Some of them may be compensating controls, some of them may be mitigating controls, but they all are here to support reducing our risk exposure. The thing, though, that I'll point out, you'll see that the status of some of these controls is compliant. However, the status of some of these controls are also non-compliant. And I would argue that if you are putting controls in place that are supposed to mitigate that risk, reducing your exposure, but the controls aren't doing what they're supposed to do, you're not actually achieving your residual risk score. How does that manifest itself in a risk management perspective? Let's move back up our risk form here. And if we take a look at the scoring section in our form, you're going to see this start to show itself. So we started off with this inherent risk score. You can see the SLE, ARO, ALE values on the screen. So it's currently set to show you the quantitative values. It's a system property that you can switch to get to a qualitative, and it would hide these values. But what we can see here is the inherent risk score here is very high. It's going to happen often, and when it does happen, there's going to be a huge financial impact to this. So the inherent score of this particular risk is very high. But we've put a good plan in place. We said these are all the controls, and we feel confident that our residual score is now low. The likelihood, our annual rate of occurrence, is much lower. It's not going to happen near as often. Because we've put some things in place, we think that the single loss expectancy of a single outage is going to be reduced, right? It went from 35 down to 10, which means our residual ALE is a much lower number, and we think this is now a lower risk, right? Our residual score is low. This is, though, where we're going to see the difference. Because we have those controls that are actually not effective. And I recommend you take a look at the continuous controls monitoring video as well. And because as we start to actively monitor the effectiveness of those controls, and they automatically are flagged non-compliant because of continuous controls monitoring, that there's a residual effect of that here in risk management, because as that control goes non-compliant, we can see that our calculated risk score is actually now elevated. So we're not achieving that residual risk score of low, and this is actually still a high risk to our organization. But how did we get to that score? We can look here and see in the monitoring section where that is actually coming from. Looking at this tab, we can actually see that our control failure factor is a factor of 55. And that's because we have 11 controls, and we look down there and we have several of them that are non-compliant, so our control failure factor is a 55. But we also have an indicator failure factor. Indicators are those things that above and beyond the controls that are put in place, if there's other data that exist within the ServiceNow platform that could have a direct impact on our overall risk score in this space, we can dynamically monitor for that. And this is something that is a real differentiator for ServiceNow. No one does what we do in this particular space. As we take a look at this indicator related list here at the bottom of our risk form, we see that there's a couple of indicators associated to this particular risk. And one of them has to do with security incidents. As we look at financial accounting, we've got a risk of a loss of availability, but there's an open security incident. Maybe there's a denial of service attack, or maybe some malware was found on a server, and we're now concerned about the availability of that from a security perspective. That's something that we should take into account when we calculate the overall risk score. So as we look at this risk indicator, we can see here on the supporting data tab that I'm on that it's looking at the impacted CIs table. It's looking for task types of security incident, and it's tied back to that CI, right, to SAP Financial Accounting. And it says if there are open incidents, security incidents for SAP Financial Accounting, then we need to elevate or escalate that risk score within the organization. I can see here at the bottom, when this last ran, that my past is false. It found that there were security incidents. And if we go back to our individual risks, we're going to see we've got an indicator failure factor that is taken into account as part of calculating our risk score as well. When we take a look at that, and we look at the monitoring tab, we can understand now that this calculated risk factor is what's going to be used to adjust our calculated score. Because we've got open security incidents, because we have non-effective controls, because we have these other things going on in the environment, ServiceNow is escalating, giving us a dynamic view into the actual key risk indicators that are actively monitoring data in your environment. You can get a real view of the exposure of risks in your organization. So as we wrap this up from a risk management perspective, we're going to go back to our risk management dashboard, but we'll see here on that dashboard where we started with that inherent risk score. We have visibility into kind of that baseline of where things are at. I'm going to remove financial accounting from my filter here so we can see where we started at from an inherent perspective. We can see that both from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. We can look at this from a residual perspective, right, and see that we're doing work to move risks from the left to the right. And all of that is available to me as a risk manager so that I really have good insight, or I have a good feel for where things actually are in our environment. There's a wide variety of other reports available to us around risk tolerance and aggregated risk information, and you can see those here on that dashboard. But this has been a walkthrough of our risk application, and from taking that risk through its life cycle, assessing it, responding to it, and actively monitoring it and adjusting that risk score as appropriate.